Hello, I'm Andrew Davenport, a PhD candidate in U.S. history at Georgetown University, and today is my second day on the job as the public historian and manager of the Getting Word African American Oral History Project here at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. I have the distinct honor today to moderate a conversation with the brilliant American historian, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Annette Gordon-Reed, the Carl M. Loeb University professor at Harvard University and a trustee of Monticello. Professor Gordon-Reed's newest book on Juneteenth is an elegant and personal volume of essays on the echoes of the past and the present and the meanings of Juneteenth, the holiday which commemorates the end of legalized slavery in Texas. Professor Gordon-Reed, this book is an American treasure, and you have my deepest admiration.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here with you.
Me too. I'm so excited. Would you please describe the origins of Juneteenth in Texas, how you celebrated Juneteenth growing up with your loved ones in Conroe, Texas, and how this regional celebration has become a cherished day for untold millions across the country?
Well, Juneteenth commemorates the day, June 19th, 1865, when United States Army General Gordon Granger came to Galveston and issued General Order Number 3, basing it on the Emancipation Proclamation, saying that slavery was over in Texas. And he also says something that he didn't have to say, but it's sort of an interesting, we might talk about this at some point, that the former enslaved people would exist and occupy, now existed in a state of absolute equality with their former enslavers, which tied the order to the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and also Lincoln's idea that the Declaration of Independence and its talk about equality was a part of American creed. That was an expectation of people who were now going to be a part of the United States of America, no longer enslaved. The first celebration was the next year, 1866, and Black Texans have celebrated it every year since then. So in my hometown, I was born in a town called Livingston, and when I was about 6 months old, my family moved to Conroe, Texas. When we celebrated Juneteenth, it was a community holiday. It was a family and a community holiday. It was a day for kids to run around throwing firecrackers. And I can't believe, I say this, but it really is a marvel to me that we were allowed to have matches and firecrackers below the age of 10 on holidays. And we drank soda water. We called it basically soda pop, but it would have to be red. We had other sodas as well, but red is supposed to be the color of Juneteenth. And so you have food that is red, you have drink that is red. I'm told that hibiscus tea was probably the first red drink that people had when they celebrated Juneteenth, because obviously they didn't have soda pop in soda water in the 19th century. Barbecue was a big part of it. And for some reason, goat was on the menu. My family didn't partake of that, but other people did. So barbecue, the traditional kind of Southern fare that you would think of that people would eat. And the twist for Texas in our family was my grandmother had gotten a recipe from my mother for making tamales. And she would sell tamales to raise money for the church, the St. Luke's United Methodist Church. They were going to build a new church. So people ordered tamales on holidays, and they ordered lots of tamales on Juneteenth. And I talk a little bit in the book about sitting with my grandmother and my mother and my grandmother's sister making hot tamales for holidays. And, I as a kid, I wanted to be outside playing, I wanted to be some other place. But now I realize what a special time that was for the women of my family to be together making tamales for this holiday. And it says a lot about Texas too, to have this mix of a dish that is from Mexico, Mesoamerican, Indian dish. Tamales were considered imported food during that time, in ancient times. And that became part of this sort of cultural mix that is Texas. So that's how I celebrated it. It was sort of a lead up to the 4th of July, which everybody celebrated. But when I was a kid, it was mainly Black Texans who celebrated Juneteenth.
Right, right. And how has Juneteenth gone national in the past several years in particular?
Well, it's interesting. I have read, and this makes perfect sense, that over the decades, particularly the last couple of decades, well, even before then, Black Texans who left Texas took the holiday with them. But
Right.
I really don't know what it is other than the advent of social media, where people post stories and pictures of Juneteenth celebrations. And some people have posited that last year was sort of a high watermark for this because of the events surrounding the killing of George Floyd, that people wanted to think about, were made to think about, come to think about race and the question of slavery and how slavery shaped the American landscape. And so this holiday that's about the end of slavery became a focal point for thinking about the institution. And I read somewhere that the number of searches about Juneteenth just skyrocketed last year. And it has become, I think, 47, I've heard that something like 47 out of the 50 states have some form of commemoration of it, which is pretty astounding. When I think about the origins of it in my backyard, throwing firecrackers and drinking too much soda water, that this would be a holiday for all Americans, and also recognized in some places. People know of it overseas.
That's amazing. It really is. And I first heard of Juneteenth through Ralph Ellison's posthumous novel, Juneteenth. Mm-hmm. But growing up where I did in Connecticut, it wasn't on my radar. But certainly over the past decade, and especially in the last couple of years, as you mentioned last year, being kind of high watermark of recognition of the holiday. It brings everything back to mind in your book. It's such a wonderful exploration of that history in the context of the holiday. As you mentioned in the book, you're a historian of slavery, a historian of families. What was it like for you here on Juneteenth to write about your own family?
Well, it's a big twist. I've written about other people's families and the past, a different state, Virginia, other places, Ohio, not Texas. It was tough. I don't typically talk a lot about myself, and I haven't talked a lot about my family because I really didn't have an occasion to do that other than mentioning things maybe in passing. But, I had to think a lot about how much I wanted to include, because I wanted the book to be primarily about Texas, the development of and the history of Texas. And I wanted to use my family as sort of a backdrop or hook or whatever to sort of begin that conversation, to hang this on and to sort of have the conversation. So for me, it was finding the right balance between being open and thinking about my family and the choice to see how much I wanted to do that. It's if you do too much. My editor and I went back and forth over the question whether I wanted to include everybody's names in it, and I wanted to give a detailed family history of all of it. And I opted not to do that because my great grandparents and those people, they're there to introduce stories about the society they were living in. And the more you talk about people, the personalize it and so forth, the more they would become the focus. And that's not really what I wanted. So it was just enough to get the ball rolling, so to speak, and then, go with the history as the main focus. But it was tough to open up and to talk about people who were no longer living, who, I don't know that they would want necessarily to be a part of my, just because I want to write a book, doesn't mean they have to get dragged into this. And so that was another reason why I wanted to be sort of limited in what it is that I put down. So it was harder. You're not as, obviously I'm not as detached as I am when I'm writing about people who are not in my family. And, but it was at the same time fun And I think it was good. It made me feel good to talk about my parents who are no longer alive, and have, for the most part, my father was alive when I start, by the time I was writing, and not, he died before I wrote the Hemingses of Monticello, and before that came out. I should say it was written, but it hadn't come out yet. And my mother died 30 years ago. So she hasn't been a part of any of this. And so it was fun talking about them, and poignant to me talking about them in this way, and recognizing some of the things they did, choosing to have me integrate our town schools, and making, they were part of history too, in a way. So it was hard, but at the same time, it was gratifying.
Thank you so much for sharing. And yes, I think you struck that perfect balance in terms of the describing your family and the community you grew up in, and the region and the state. I think is perfectly balanced. Thank you. We have a question in the chat from a viewer, Elaine, who asks, and this is getting back to the origins of Juneteenth. Elaine asks, because of communications at the time, was there a lag in when people understood themselves to have been emancipated following Field Order Number 3? And what repercussions did that have?
Well, the lag was the Confederate Army. I mean, Lee surrendered in April of 1865. And most people think, okay, so everybody folded up the flag and went home. But the Army of the Trans-Mississippi kept fighting in the Southwest. So the Emancipation Proclamation could not go into effect in places that were not under control of the United States, obviously, and Texas was not, until the beginning of June, when the Army of, as I said, the Confederate Army, the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, there were different armies. Everybody thinks Lee's the head of everything, and all the troops, but there were other troops other places. And when they surrendered at the beginning of June, that's when Granger, who was stationed in Louisiana, was told to go to Texas and take control of that theater. And that's when the day he got there, he issued General Order Number 3. So the repercussions that it had was that it made the Texans, enslaved people in Texas, almost 200,000 people, it made them the last group of people to be freed because of, at the end of the military conflict. And the story is told as if it's just that nobody knew about this. I think people knew about this, but there's nothing you can do about it if you're not in control of the territory. And they were not in control of the territory, finally, until they surrendered. And that's when he made his announcement.
That's such a critical reframing there.
Because it is, you think people have to remember this was a war. This is wartime. And it's not to say that, the Confederates, the sort of organized effort ended. There was still more violence to come after all of this. But this was a part of the result of the final surrender. And then he was able to make this announcement.
Right. And what a joyous jubilee that was, and that Black Texans have celebrated ever since. In on Juneteenth, I have my copy here on page 37. You write that the tyranny of ideas about the archive, or what constitutes the official record, all too often has buried African Americans' knowledge and rendered it suspect. This is so, you write, despite the fact that it is well known that such people were operating under an oppression that deliberately prevented them from creating parts of the archive or making official records. And you ask, what is the morality that would say that the oppressor's version of historical events should naturally take precedence over the knowledge of the oppressed? Would you please describe, Professor Gordon-Reed, how this line of questioning received narratives of the past has motivated you not only to interpret Thomas Jefferson, but also to Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, of course, and families enslaved by Jefferson, but also here on the subject of Texas and on Juneteenth?
Well, the stories, the oral histories of African American families, the actions of African American families, their understanding of what happened during slavery, uh, is given short shrift in lots. It has been given short shrift. This is again, this is a memoir talking about me growing up. Things have gotten much better now in schools, and I think that's one of the reasons for the backlash that we're seeing now, because people talk about race and they talk about slavery in classes in ways that we did not. But if you only look at family letters, if you only look at so-called official documents, and you don't think about the views and the family stories and the actions of the people who were sort of living under this oppression, you're not getting the whole story. The story is not just the story. Texas is not just the story of whites who were there. It's the stories of indigenous people, the stories of African American people, the story of Latino culture as well. I mean, they're more part of the written documentary record, but in a different language. And very often that's given short shrift. It's all about the English and what people who are speaking English are doing. So this is a plea, that passage is a plea to broaden the net. Think about the archive, the traditional archive that we have. You have to deal with that, letters and documents and so forth. But think about family stories that can often be checked against other documents, can be checked against other things we know about the time period, to try to get as complete a picture of the situation as you can.
That's right. Thank you. I'm thinking of anthropologist David Scott, who wrote a wonderful essay called On the Archaeologies of Black Memory, describing this exact process of expanding the archive. You've done that throughout your career, looking specifically. I'm thinking of your extremely careful read of Madison Hemmings' oral testimony that was ignored or just misinterpreted or deliberately so. And again, you talk here about some of the events, particularly the murder of Bob White in your hometown in Texas. Was that news to you? And could you describe some of the really challenging, violent history you describe in these pages on Juneteenth as well?
I mean, I talk about the story of Bob White in relationship in the chapter in which I talk about integrating my town schools, to try to give a picture of what Conroe, Texas was like, what the reputation of Conroe was at that time. This is a story of Bob White is the story that my grandfather used to talk about when I was a little girl. And it was the story of a man who worked picking cotton in Livingston, and where I was born. I lived in Livingston about 6 months, and then my parents moved to Conroe. But Livingston was, I visited a big part of my life because I was there back and forth almost every weekend visiting my grandparents. And he would talk about Bob White. He knew Bob White. He knew the Cochrans. Dude Cochran was the husband, and Ruby Cochran was the woman that Bob White was alleged to have raped. He was arrested and he was taken into custody, and the Texas Rangers took him out at night and tied him to a tree and beat him until he confessed. He was made to sign X on a confession. He couldn't read or write, and he had no lawyer for a time. And he was found guilty and sentenced to the electric chair for this rape. And my grandfather's story, and so to think about the difference in narratives, my grandfather's story and the story in the Black community was that the two had Cochran, Ruby Cochran, and Bob White had an affair. And when the husband found out about it, this was transformed into an idea of assault. Now, this is a story that you hear across the South. And I, as a historian, I'm not making a claim to know the truth of this one way or the other, but it is the fact that there was a competing narrative about it. But there's also the truth that taking somebody into the woods and tying them to a tree and beating them till they confessed and then sending them to the electric chair is a problem. So the case, I didn't know this until I was working on the book. This case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I teach criminal procedure in law school. And when I teach confessions, coerced confessions. I used Brown v. Mississippi, which a similar kind of thing happened there, not knowing that there was this case that, my grandfather told me about when I was a little girl that was sort of a parallel. I mean, it's another case that I could have used in my class. Well, it goes up to the court, and not surprisingly, the Supreme Court says that taking somebody out and beating them until they confess is a violation of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And they sent it back down for a trial. And instead of sending it to Livingston, where they needed to change a venue, they sent it to Conroe. Conroe was 50 miles south of Livingston, and there were different people, and everybody knew everybody in Livingston, like in a little town like that. Conroe's small, Livingston is even smaller. And while he's on trial, the husband, Dude Cochran, comes into the courthouse and shoots him in the back of the head, Bob White in the back of the head. He dies instantly. And Cochran is charged and acquitted in about 3 minutes for, basically for premeditated murder. He goes into the courtroom. He clearly planned to do this and shot this man in front of the judge, the jury, spectators, lawyers, everybody. And he gets off and everybody cheers. And that was the kind of town that Conroe was. And there were other instances. A man was burned at the stake on the courthouse, that same courthouse, a dozen years before then, a little bit over a dozen years before then. There were lynchings. There was just a really, really tough racial atmosphere. And the thing is that Cochran, the Bob White story, is really just about 25 years, a little over 25 years before I am integrating the schools in Conroe. And that's not a long time. The memory of that had not faded. The atmosphere that was created by things like that had not gone had not gone away. So we live with the legacies of these kinds of things, and they're important to know about. I mean, it explains a lot about the town when you know things like that happened.
That's right. And it seems, as you write on Juneteenth, it certainly informed perhaps the students of the school which you integrated, but it certainly informed the adults in the community and the white adults in the community.
Yeah, there was a hierarchy here. I mean, Bob White, Dude Cochran was seen as avenging his wife and, taking the law into his hands. I mean, a black man obviously could not have walked into a courthouse and shot a white man in the back of the head and, murdered him and gotten away with it, even if his wife had been raped. I mean, it just wouldn't have happened. That was a part of the power that white men had during that time period. And, that was linked to this notion of of them having, the right to control African American people, which was what lynching was about. But I say in the book, and I think this is true, I can imagine how the black people of the time felt as they watched this case go all the way up to the Supreme Court. In other words, there were people who were protesting this. There were white people who were involved, lawyers who were involved in bringing the case and defending him and getting a new trial and sending it back down. So that must have brought a lot of hope that at least he would get a fair trial and there would be a hearing about this. And the fact that he walked in and killed him, which, again, if you wanted to be conspiratorial about these kinds of things, it's always been in the back of my mind. Yeah. Why was it important to silence him? I mean, before the trial, before anybody could testify and talk about things, and maybe they thought that the more proceedings would go on, more things might come out. But whatever it was a moment when I know there must have been hopes for justice, and the murder of his murder, and then with no repercussion, was crushing. I had family members who refused to spend the night in Conroe for years after that, not just because they were afraid. I think it was because just a principle that they didn't want to be there. But and if I just could say, I considered myself as having had a happy childhood growing up. I mean, I had all the kinds of things that kids, I had parents and my brothers, and we ran around and had fun, and we jumped rope, rode bicycles, played with firecrackers, all that kind of stuff. But there was always that tension. There was the knowledge that if things got out of hand, um, you would never know what could happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I understand. You write that the American story is endlessly complicated. We note and accept complications in our personal lives. We note and understand complications in every facet of our life, but it's not really when it comes to history.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that throughout on Juneteenth and throughout your career as well. What does that say about Juneteenth, and how might Juneteenth and the stories that you tell in the book, and even the stories that we tell at Monticello, help us to recognize and learn from the painful and the triumphant aspects of the past?
Well, I think the story is, Juneteenth is tailor-made for seeing that kind of complexity, because as these people are celebrating and are happy about what has happened, there are also people who are not happy about it. So it was hope in the midst of hostility, the hostility of others. It was the knowledge that even though legal, slavery in Texas was going to be over at this point, that there was a long way to go, that it was going to be a struggle, and that there would be backlash, and there would be 2 steps forwards and sometimes maybe 3 steps backward. So I think it's in telling the story of Juneteenth, you can tell the story of all of that, the feelings, the feelings of all of the people, whites, blacks, and whites who were supportive of black people, black people's rights, and there were some. I think the story lends itself to be a moment, a time of education. So you have to explain, well, who is Gordon Granger, and what is the general order, and why this is important, why Texas at this point and not earlier. There are all these points where you can bring in new information and try to paint a fuller picture of everything. So it's tailor-made, in my view, tailor-made for education. And it makes it great for kids because they understand the celebrating part of it, and the food and the getting together. But it's also, as the kids get to be older, they can understand what this really meant, what this meant for the Texans, and what it meant for the United States and for the world. Because this is, anytime there was, as you well know, emancipation was a process, right? It's not all one thing and then you wave a wand. But this was an advance in human rights. And anytime that happens, we should pause and think about it.
Yes. Yes. On my second read through of On Juneteenth, I noticed a piece that hadn't quite registered with me the first time around, but you make a really important counter argument to William Faulkner, who wrote that the past is never dead. It's not even past. And you write, if I can quote you again, and believe me, I will quote you all the time. You write that I believe the Nobel laureate was wrong. The past is dead. But like other formerly living things, echoes of the past remain, leaving their traces in the people and events of the present and the future. And I notice the metaphor of the echo, the trope of the echo that continues throughout the book. And I wonder if you could talk to us about how these echoes, in terms of nostalgic representations of the past in popular media, how do these echoes return to us in a kind of feedback loop, as you described?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Faulkner thing has always been something of a pet peeve for me. So I get my chance to get that in there, because I think the idea, I think when he meant it, when he's talking about a past, is sort of a lament almost for a lost cause, for a lost understanding of the South. His understanding of the South. And this is almost a defiance in saying, we'll never get over this. The past will always be with us. It will always be, you'll be charging up the hill, and, in Gettysburg or whatever. And Yeah, and it's like, no, no, we don't. You know, he's every
Right.
boy, every Southern boy. There's some moment in his life when he's doing that. No, no, there's Southern boys who don't care about that now. There's Southern boys who are, you know, from different cultures who don't remember that and don't care to bring that back. And I mean, so I think for him, I suspect from some of the other things that he did and wrote. And Faulkner was a great writer, and don't get me wrong about this, but this is a defiance that we're always going to hold these values, and the past, we will always have this here. Now, he may be right, but I don't think it's the real past. We've changed. Things have happened. There have been advances, and but the echoes of the past,
Yes.
the people who are holding on to this, whether it's a racial hierarchy, whether it's in attitudes about women, whatever was in the past, some of those things are still with us. As I was talking about Bob White, you know, how could you be in a town where someone was burned at the stake, where there were other kind of lynchings, where a person was shot in an open court and got off because the person he shot was Black, and you know, how can that not shape the attitudes of the people who lived during that time, that they transmit to their kids? This is still relatively new. So I think all of those things are there, but my point is that you don't have to be hostage to that.
Right.
And being hostage to the past. I mean, well, it's Jefferson. I suppose we can't get through this day without mentioning him at some point. The earth belongs to the living. You know, the living generation, every generation of people has to chart its course in a way, and should not be bound to living by the precepts and the values of people long ago. I mean, we recognize those things, and we take the good things, and we leave the things that we don't want, the baggage we don't want to carry. We don't have to keep carrying it. And those echoes, but you do have to recognize that those echoes are there. If you're wondering why, I mean, why is it a big deal that a Black kid goes to a white school? Why is this in some places? Why do they have to be escorted by armed guards? I mean, what's going on here? How did this get started? And I think my experience going to Anderson and thinking about that time period, that probably put me on the road to being a historian, because I was thinking about, or, you know, certainly on the road to loving history as a subject, whether I became a historian or not, but loving the topic of history is wondering why. Why is this a big deal? And then you think, well, there was this thing called slavery. Oh, yes. And slavery was racially based. Only people of your race could be enslaved in this place. I mean, hasn't been true throughout human history. Other groups have been enslaved, but here in this setting, it's not about being a captive in war. It's not about that. It's, you know, because that was the original, for most of history, it's been that, you know, we could have killed you. So the fact that we're keeping you alive as slaves is a benefit in a way, is, you know, we have the right to do that. That's not what this is about. This is about your race, what your mother is. If your mother is of African descent, even partly of African descent, and, you know, is enslaved, then you're going to be enslaved. So from there to think about, you know, how did this come about, and how much of this do we want to keep? How do we get out of it? That's those questions. Thinking about the echoes of the past is what led me to want to become a person who studied history.
And what is it like now when you return to Texas and you see, I understand there's a mural of a representation of you and a bust of you as well. Is that in Livingston or in Conroe?
That's in Conroe. That's in Conroe.
What is it like for you to see that when you return home?
Well, it's very nice. It's very nice. Obviously, that, you know, the people of the town thought that was a gesture that they wanted to make. I wish my parents were alive. They would get such a kick out of that. I can imagine they would get a kick out of it. But it's a representative. I mean, it shows that things change. You know, that wouldn't have happened in the 1960s. You know, the schools now have Black principals, Black administrators. That would have been inconceivable when I was a kid. So this place has been, not totally, obviously, we're still working. There are lots of things to work on, but much of the town has been transformed, the sort of racial atmosphere. I go to Walmart's and when I'm down there and I go shopping or whatever, and I see white women with their obviously mixed race grandchildren sitting in the carts, going around the aisles. Would not have happened. I see Indian people, East Indian people, Asian people, even more Hispanic people. Because when I grew up, Conroe was basically white people of German and English extraction and Black people. We didn't really have many Latino people but now that has been transformed as well. So it's a different place. And all of the people that are there now with their customs and their values are changing things. There are different problems, to be sure, but it's it was not the sort of binary black, white, in, out kind of thing that it was when I was growing up. So it's gratifying to see those kinds of changes, even though we want to see more progress. We always want that, but it was not like, it's different from when I grew up there.
Thank you, Professor. I understand that you have several other speaking engagements today to talk about your wonderful new book on Juneteenth, and so we'll settle the conversation there. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for the work that you have done throughout your career and for telling us a little bit about your personal life, your community's life, and the Juneteenth holiday in Texas and beyond. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.